There was a time, up to the end of the Second World War, when the British aviation industry led the world. Those days are almost gone, but some echoes remain. One of its earliest commercial successes was this aircraft, the de Havilland Dragon Rapide, which was designed as a short-haul airliner and entered service in 1934. Although wood and fabric construction was already falling out of favour and the American airline industry pushed ahead with metal aircraft from the likes of Boeing and Douglas, what European operators most wanted was a simple aircraft that could provide short-haul passenger and freight services reliably and with low operating costs. The Rapide fit the bill and it became the most successful British short-haul passenger aircraft of the 1930s, but it lived on after the war in commercial operations across more than 20 countries. The Dragon served a niche market well, and it was the aircraft Desmond Norman set out to replace when he and John Britton designed the BN-2 Islander in 1963. Niche markets were something Norman well understood. With Britton and Jim McMahon, he'd built what was then the largest agricultural spraying company in the world, and it had taken him to the far corners of every continent where he'd seen great opportunity for a new aircraft. So a cursory look at the Islander identifies it as a practical, no-frills workhorse of an aircraft. It's all metal, of course, and that uninterrupted rectangular fuselage is a very practical shape for stacking freight. It's not going to win any beauty contests, but perhaps its elegance lies in the simplicity of its design and construction. That high wing, for example, has a single box spar that runs from tip to tip. There are no hydraulics. All controls are operated by conventional cables and rods without such niceties as power assistance. A closer look reveals a lot more about the Islander's purpose. That steeply raked aft fuselage speaks of steep getaways, while the tall and widely spaced landing gear, fixed of course for simplicity, keeps the props well clear of the ground in spite of the tricycle gear. Fat wheels, and 2 on each main leg, running on low pressure tyres, and those big barn door flaps leave us in no doubt that this aircraft's primary purpose is to get passengers and freight in and out of the tightest spaces, runway or not. That it does this job so well has made the Islander not only the best-selling British transport aircraft in history, it's also the only one that's still in production to this day. For about $1 million you can buy yourself a brand new hand-built Islander, largely assembled in Romania but still commissioned at the BN plant on the Isle of Wight. So what can this aircraft actually do? Well, it's designed to operate out of rough and unprepared strips as short as 1150 feet, rather like this one in fact, so let's have a go. Conditions are fairly favourable today. We've got a moderate outside air temperature with minimal wind, and this field's pretty much at sea level. This is a 1200 foot strip, which is pretty close to the published limit for the Islander, but this is a fairly well maintained grass strip, and it's got a little bit of a slope. That should work in our favour. It's only about 1.5%, but every little counts. We have very little to worry about in this aircraft. Throttle, prop and mixture controls, flaps for takeoff and landing, auxiliary fuel pumps for takeoff and landing, and carb heat if we need it. We have 2 flap settings, down to 56 degrees for the approach. We want the 25 degree setting for now. It's a popular quip that the Islander flight manual is very short. It just says 65 knots. 65 is the best angle of climb speed, VY, with 1 engine or 2, and it's also the final approach speed. And that's most of what you need to know to fly this bird, at least in the sim. We've got temperature gauges to monitor and fuel feeds to manage, but apart from that the consensus is that the Islander flies like a twin-engine Cessna 172 essentially. In that sense it's kind of sluggish at low speed but climbs impressively under power. It's also got big ailerons and almost a 50-foot wingspan, so it has a lot of adverse yaw and needs fairly active rudder control. It's a lot heavier than a 172 of course, and it does need more assertive management in the flare, especially as you tend to be dropping in fairly steeply those tight strips. Stall speed seems ridiculously low for such a lumbering beast. It's in the region of 46 knots clean, down to about 40 knots at full flap depending on the load. IFR equipment is part of the basic Islander spec, and this one also has a Bendix King GPS and autopilot. The GPS is a whole tutorial in itself, and I'm not going to cover it here. If you have the Aerosoft Catalina, it's almost exactly the same GPS unit. The only difference is the Cat 1 is approach certified, but if you want to cheat like me, you can just edit aircraft.cfg and use the basic portable GPS. So we got out of that little strip comfortably and with no fuss, but getting in is always going to be a bit trickier. So we're approaching our destination, and it's always good to make a bit of a low pass to check out an unfamiliar strip first. In fact, if we were landing here for real, we'd probably want to study the plan in detail before setting off, because this strip's a bit marginal, shall we say. So what do we have here? Well, it's an 1100 foot runway, so it's quite short, but working in our favour, it has a significant uphill slope over the first 500 feet or so that's going to help slow us down. In fact, this is about a 1 in 10 gradient, which is quite a lot, and it does mean we need to think about our technique. The far end of the runway is going to be out of sight when we touch down. We've also got various obstacles to negotiate, and the main problem here is these bushes and this fence. The Islander's wingspan is our limiting factor here, and we're only just going to clear this gap if we stick close to the fence. The best approach is going to have us aiming slightly off centre here to make the most of this area, and then to swing around onto heading so we miss the bushes at the top. And it's crucial that we touch down as early as possible so we make best use of the available space. So that's the plan, now we just have to do it. There's only one credible approach to this field, and if the wind was against us we wouldn't attempt it. Trying to fly at around 65 knots, progressing to full flaps. We'd want to come in a bit steeper in a single in case we lost the engine, but here we still need to make sure we're going to miss all those trees. We're flying into a kind of a basin here, and we need to make sure we touch down pretty close to the bottom, bearing in mind the plan we made for avoiding all the obstacles. We're going to need a much exaggerated flare, and then we need to add a bit of power because we're literally flying uphill, and that's going to give us a higher angle of attack than our eyes are telling us. The aircraft has plenty of power to drag us up the hill if we stop, so we can chop the power and use the brakes as much as we like as soon as we're on the ground. So this is actually a very easy aircraft to fly, which, although it reflects the aircraft in real life, makes it a fairly undemanding aircraft in FSX. Incidentally, that tricycle gear gives the real Islander an amazing crosswind performance. It can handle up to 35 knots without resorting to differential engine power. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be replicated in the virtual aircraft. I found it wouldn't track straight even in modest crosswind. The lasting value is probably more in campaigning the aircraft realistically, managing loads and fuel while flying into and out of small strips under real weather conditions and IFR. In FSX, the Islander comes across as a basic but fairly refined aircraft. I'm not sure how well this matches its real world image, and you'll find all kinds of jokey references on the web to its noisiness and its agricultural feel. The sounds are well done though, and they do capture something of that lumbering, rattly feel as you trundle across the rough strips. Should be fairly evident here, the external model is mostly finished to a high standard, although there are a couple of surprising low-res bitmaps here and there. Some of the liveries, like this one, have bare metal prop spinners, and because the engines sit right outside the windows, one thing I found quite jarring was the reflection map, which clearly shows a different landscape to the one we're flying over here. The virtual cockpit's well done, quite a nice layout in spite of the Islander's basic slab-like panel. Got a nice overhead panel here. All the aircraft have identical blue painted panels, which is a slight irony given that every modern Islander is hand-built to customer specifications. But there are alternative colour schemes available if you know where to look. I found the gauges were very shimmery and indistinct at first, but turns out they are very sensitive to the anti-aliasing setting on your video card, and particularly evident if you use track IR. I don't know to what extent this is a feature of the gauges themselves, but once I had things set up, the panel was fine. The Islander was, of course, a success, and of around 1,200 aircraft produced, more than 750 are still flying in many roles, including passenger and freight, haulage, police and air ambulance, search and rescue, and various military applications. For the virtual aviator, the Islander offers a step up from small single-engined aircraft to commercial level aviation, with the challenges of flying multi-engine and IFR in a very accessible package. This is an aircraft you can literally jump into and go, and yet as you grow into it you can begin to appreciate it on deeper levels, particularly if you take up the challenge of its rather idiosyncratic autopilot and GPS. Although it could never be described as a pretty aircraft in real life, the virtual Islander is actually a very appealing model, and as you'll see here, the nighttime cockpit is particularly attractive. Lasting appeal will naturally be a very personal thing, but for me, at least for now, it's become the ride of choice.